Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone joining us tonight. My name is Bob Abbey. I'm an adult services librarian for the city of Forest Grove, and I want to welcome you all to this evening's program entitled The Ghosts of Our Past, a history of housing, displacement, discrimination, and segregation in Oregon. We're very pleased to have Sam Goldberg from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon joining us tonight. Before I bring Sam on, I want to just mention a couple of things. First of all, I want to give a shout out to our program on April 19th. This is a program in partnership with Pacific University, and it's called No More Kindred. See what we did there? No More Kindred, having difficult conversations across the political divide. Now, this is not a live stream program. This is a Zoom program. And in order to participate, you will need to register. And I'm going to pop the URL for that in the chat. So you can go ahead and sign up for that. This is going to be a really interesting workshop. It's a 90-minute workshop. Two of our friends from Pacific University will be leading this, and it's really designed to provide you with some tools for having difficult conversations with family, friends, and loved ones who share different political beliefs and opinions than you do. This is not about how to win those arguments. That's a whole other issue. This is really about how do you listen for understanding? How do you learn to ask questions? How do you hope to find common ground? So this is, I think, a fascinating program. We're really excited about working with Pacific University on this one. And again, that's Tuesday, April 19th, so 2 weeks from tonight, starting at 6:30, and that's on Zoom. So if you're interested in signing up, you can copy that link and head on over and register, completely free, and we hope to see you there. I also want to mention our very generous underwriters for this program and also for another program that we have had in the library for the past couple of weeks from the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. This program and that exhibit that we had on site were funded through a generous grant made possible by the Oregon Humanities, National Endowment for the Humanities, Oregon Cultural Trust, the Standard, and Stoel Rives LLP. So there I am. And we are really pleased to have Sam Goldberg with us tonight. Sam is the Education and Outreach Specialist at the Fair Housing Council of Oregon, where he focuses on history and affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH trainings, as well as the bus tour program. And I know we'll hear a little bit about that in Sam's presentation. Sam also coordinates the activities of the AFFH Systemic Investigations Committee, which is a collection of land use professionals and Fair Housing Council of Oregon staff that serves as a watchdog for local planning activities and strategizes how best to advance AFFH in state policies. And he also provides technical support for jurisdictions. This is a really busy month for Fair Housing Council of Oregon staff because this is National Fair Housing Month. And we are very fortunate to be able to have Sam join us tonight. So Sam, I'm going to bring you onto the stream. Good evening.
Hi.
So tonight's program will consist of Sam's presentation, and I will leave the stream as always. And then when Sam is done, I'll come back in and we'll have a discussion. As always, these programs are interactive. So if you're watching on Facebook, please feel free to ask a question in the comment section. If you're watching on YouTube, you can post a question there. You do need to have a YouTube account if you want to interact. And the last thing I'll mention is at the end of this evening's program, we're going to provide a link to a survey that we'd like you to complete. And this is for the Fair Housing Council of Oregon. This is a way for them to kind of assess and evaluate the programs that they do in the community. So I'll provide a link to that when Sam is done, and then also at the end of the evening. So you'll get a couple of opportunities to click on that. So Sam, I'm going to bring your presentation into the stream, and then I'm going to back out, and we will see you when you're done.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. I'm sorry. So I am ready to go?
You are ready to go.
Okay, great. Let me know once I change my slide the first time if it does not seem to change. But this is all a little new to me. It's slightly different technology, but I appreciate you bearing with me. Good evening. Thank you so much, Bob, for having me in the Forest Grove City Library, and to everyone who's joining tonight. I hope you have gotten a chance to see the fair housing display at the library. We always appreciate it when local institutions like that are willing to exhibit our display. Fair Housing Month, as Bob mentioned, is very busy for us, and it is a busy time for the display. However, after this month and into the summer and fall, we are always looking for opportunities to put up the historical display. So if you know other places in the area that it might be a good fit for, let us know. Reach out to us. I'll have contact information at the end. So yeah, you can reach out to us on that. But let me jump in. So as Bob mentioned, I'm an education and outreach specialist at the Fair Housing Council. I do statewide activities. I talk to people from all over the state, mostly about land use issues, but a lot about history. One of my responsibilities is coordinating our historic bus tour, in which groups have the opportunity to visit sites of historic discrimination and segregation around Portland and hear directly from people who were affected by those things. We will be covering much of the same information that we do in the bus tour, but I acknowledge that there's no way for me to replace the lived experiences of our presenters. So someday when we are able to run in-person bus tours again, I hope that you all have the opportunity to take it because it's a really amazing experience. It's one of the most important pieces of our programming because too often we separate historical events and current actions. So yes, as we've talked a lot about for the last couple of years, discrimination is a current live issue, but it also can't be divorced from its historical context. And similarly, the history that I'm going to be talking about today is long, but it's also far from over. In order to understand one, you have to understand both. In the words of William Faulkner, the past is never dead, it's not even past. Now, I want to briefly address the fact that I will occasionally be using some language in this presentation which is widely considered outdated and offensive. In each case, I will be directly quoting from a historical document that I think is critical to what I'm talking about, but I do acknowledge that it is unpleasant and harmful to hear the words. Now, before I go any further, I want to also acknowledge that the land that I speak to you from rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many others. The question of who owns the land and who can claim Oregon as their home is central to the history that we'll be discussing today, and that history begins and ends with the indigenous Oregonians, who were nearly exterminated by settler colonialism, yet survive as peoples and cultures and nations today. Now, we're going to get to that story a little bit about the Fair Housing Council of Oregon now. We are a statewide nonprofit civil rights organization founded a little over 31 years ago. We educate tenants, landlords, home buyers, realtors, lenders, and jurisdictions on rights and responsibilities under federal, state, and local fair housing law. So FHCO also is involved in enforcing fair housing law in addition to our education activities. And we have a hotline to assist individuals who believe that they have experienced discrimination. I'll have more on that at the end. So let's talk about what is fair housing. Fair housing is the right of all people to be free from discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So that raises the question, what are fair housing laws? Well, they are civil rights laws that promote equal access to housing. They make it illegal for housing providers to discriminate against certain groups. And discrimination in this context means treating any person differently in any housing transaction because that person is a member of a protected class. So in the first Fair Housing Act in 1968, the federal protected classes were race, color, national origin, and religion. So if you're being discriminated against on the basis of any of those things, then that is illegal under the Fair Housing Act. Gender, it was added in the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, familial status, meaning families with children, and disability were also added. In Oregon, under our Fair Housing Act, we have some additional protected classes. We have marital status, source of income. That means Section 8 vouchers, agency checks. It doesn't matter if you're getting it from one of those sources. You can't be discriminated against. Sexual orientation and gender identity. That's actually now covered under the Federal Protection of Sex. But we in Oregon have actually been protecting it for quite a bit longer. Status as a survivor of domestic violence. And protections continue to expand. We have local ordinances, HUD rulings, and cases. So the story that I'm going to tell you today is the story of why the Fair Housing Act was and still is necessary. So I'd like to start with a little exercise. There was an interesting Yale study in 2017 which asked Americans their perception of the racial wealth gap. They asked, for every $100 in wealth accumulated by an average white family, how much wealth has the average Black family accumulated? So before I tell you the answer, take a look at those options, think about it, think how much wealth has been accumulated by the average Black family for every $100 in wealth accumulated by the average white family. So according to the Census Bureau's population survey, for every $100 in white family wealth, Black families hold just $5.04. And this is from 2017. There is preliminary evidence that the gap has grown since then, particularly during the pandemic. Meanwhile, survey takers believed that Black families hold about $85 in wealth for every $100 in white family wealth. The study concluded that given how economically and racially segregated the country remains, many Americans, especially wealthy whites, have little direct knowledge of what life looks like for families in other demographic groups. But here's the statistic that I find even more startling. The gap is growing. And I mean that both in terms of the actual racial wealth gap, which remains stubbornly high, and the perceived racial wealth gap, which has increased every time this question has been asked since 1960. So why do we believe that progress has been made on these issues when indicators continually trend in the wrong direction? Well, in order to understand that, we have to address the issue that those Yale researchers raised. Why don't we see each other? Why are we so segregated? Well, let's start by looking at our state's demographics. Oregon has a population that is about 75.1% white, non-Hispanic, and about 2% of our residents are African American. Now, that on its own doesn't really mean anything, so let's compare it to our neighbors. For reference, Washington State, which was once part of the Oregon Territory, is 67.5% white and about 4% African American. And in California, 36.5% are white and 6.5% are Black. So how did Oregon become so homogenous relative to our neighbors? Well, it was not by accident. So let's start with the Oregon Trail. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, Oregon was far from empty before white settlement. More than 60 tribes lived in what is today Oregon for thousands of years. But by the mid-1800s, 80% of the Willamette Valley population had been killed. And while it is true that many of those who died fell victim to diseases such as smallpox, tuberculosis, and cholera spread unintentionally or not by white settlers, it is also true that the death toll may not have been so catastrophic had it not been paired with the violent reduction of ancestral lands, creating overcrowding on reservations, being cut off from traditional food sources, and being largely denied medical assistance by the federal government. So it was only once indigenous peoples had been removed or exterminated that Oregon could be claimed as free or empty land for white settlement. After the signing of the Oregon Treaty in 1846, establishing the 49th parallel as the boundary between the US and Canada, the US government wanted to solidify its claim by rapidly expanding the permanent white population here. That meant getting away from the fur trapping, which had previously been the main American commerce in the region, and towards things like farming, particularly by families. So to incentivize this, Congress passed the Donation Land Act, which gave 320 acres to single men and 640 acres to married couples. The law explicitly limited this opportunity to whites, or in some cases, quote, half-breed Indians. This is also a clear example of an institutional decision which creates generational racial inequity, something which was pointed out by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. some 118 years later.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farm. Not only that, today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. This is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington, in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
So in the decades prior to the Civil War, the national conversation was fixated on the issue of slavery. There were African-American slaves in Oregon, although we don't know how many. And there were advocates for Oregon joining the Union as a slave state. However, Oregon went in a very different direction. They banned not just the practice of slavery, but all African Americans. This actually predates statehood. The 1844 Amendment to Organic Law provided that any African American found in the Oregon Territory shall receive upon his or her back not less than 20 nor more than 39 stripes, to be inflicted by the constable of the proper county. This punishment would be repeated every few months until the individual left. The ban on Black people was then enshrined in the 1859 Constitution, when Oregon became a free, but exclusionary state, just before the Civil War. Article 35 of the adopted Constitution reads, quote, no free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of the adopted Constitution shall come, reside, or be within the state, or hold any real estate. This section was not eliminated until 1927, well into the Great Migration, which is when African Americans fleeing racial violence in the South moved to the Northeast, Midwest, and West. These refugees, however, largely avoided Oregon. Now, as with African Americans, Chinese workers who arrived starting in the 1850s were subject to their own specific exclusionary clause in the state constitution. Quote, no Chinaman not a resident of the state at the adoption of this constitution shall ever hold any real estate or work in any mining claim therein. So while there was an unwillingness to ban Chinese labor, the government made it clear that they were not to be regarded as permanent residents. This section was not repealed until 1943. So Chinese workers were critical to Oregon's early industries, such as canneries and railroad construction, but a series of economic crises in the 1870s and 80s greatly increased anti-Chinese sentiment in Oregon. This scapegoating, combined with the growing stability of those Chinese communities, led to the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. As the name suggests, it virtually eliminated immigration from China until it was repealed also in 1943, when China was our ostensible ally during World War II. There had been sizable Chinatowns in Jacksonville, John Day, Baker City, Pendleton, Salem, Klamath Falls, Canyon City, Auburn, Astoria, and Albany. But by the end of the 19th century, a wave of anti-Chinese violence had spread across the West, which further concentrated the Chinese population in cities like Portland. And this wave of violence culminated in late May of 1887, when a gang of 7 white men robbed, murdered, and mutilated 34 Chinese miners in Hell's Canyon on the Snake River. Over the next several days, the dozens of bodies began to wash ashore downriver, striking fear in the Chinese community and further emboldening white hostility. One of the perpetrators confessed the following year, identifying his 6 compatriots. However, only 3 of them were indicted, and all of them eventually were found not guilty. In 2005, the location was renamed Chinese Massacre Cove. Now, at the dawn of the 20th century, and in spite of the still on the books exclusion laws, Oregon did develop a small African-American population, the heart of which was in Portland along Northwest Broadway and near Union Station, in part because railroad porter was one of the few jobs, few occupations Black Oregonians were allowed to work in at the time. There were some Black-owned businesses, most notably the Golden West, which was once the largest Black-owned hotel west of the Mississippi. But besides these bright spots, many public accommodations, including theaters, roller rinks, music venues, amusement parks, and swimming pools, were all segregated. Private clubs, such as the Multnomah Athletic Club and Arlington Club, would not allow Jews or people of color until 1958. Sundown laws, which barred non-whites from being in a jurisdiction after sunset, were pervasive throughout the state, and in some cases remained on the books or displayed on signage into the 1960s and 1970s. From 1890 to 1930, even though the overall African-American population in Oregon increased, the number of counties without any African-American residents also increased from 1 to 4, and the number with less than 10 residents increased from 16 to 20. So just like we saw in the earlier wave of anti-Chinese violence, where the Chinese communities in more rural areas of the state were driven out and concentrated in bigger cities like Portland, the same thing was happening to Black communities throughout the state. Now, it's not a coincidence that that period also saw the peak of KKK activity in Oregon. The first Ku Klux Klan arose in the South to end Reconstruction reforms and unleash horrific violence against African Americans. But the second Klan actually started in the late 19-teens nationwide, spurred by the success of D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation. It boasted anywhere from 2 to 6 million members nationwide, and the state of Oregon had the largest per capita membership in the country. However, because of the history of anti-Black exclusion in Oregon, there wasn't actually a large Black population for them to target. So the Oregon Klan became particularly nativist, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish. At their height, they counted hundreds of elected officials, police chiefs, newspaper editors, and businessmen among their ranks, effectively controlling many cities and towns. And in addition to their more secretive activities, they pursued a number of legal campaigns. For instance, they boycotted Catholic and Jewish businesses like Meyer and Frank. They opposed Catholic candidates, and they tried to get Catholics in prominent positions fired. In what was probably their most stunning show of power, the Klan successfully passed a ban on private schools, a measure which almost exclusively shut down Catholic and Jewish institutions. The measure was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1925. Nationally, the Klan's crowning achievement was the 1924 Immigration Act, which substantially reduced immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and eliminated immigration from Asia and Africa. So this is 1924, just over a decade later. This very law would prevent hundreds of thousands of Jews and Roma from escaping the Nazi regime. That system would remain in place with only minor alterations until 1965. And just as the Klan was rising to prominence, many of the institutions we know today came into being, with racial discrimination baked in from the very beginning. The first Realtor Code of Ethics in 1919 instructed realtors to preserve the racial makeup of community. And racially restrictive language written into deeds could prevent homes from being sold to non-whites in perpetuity. So if you live in a home in Oregon that was built before 1959, I recommend that you look at the deed to your house in the city records, as it may well contain a racially restrictive covenant. So according to the American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers, property values were not simply based on the brick and mortar composition of a home, but the racial composition of the neighborhood. That value could be determined based on this list of ethnic favorability. And having a member of what this list considered a less favorable ethnic group living even within 4 blocks of you could severely reduce the appraised value. So institutions like the real estate appraisers, like the Realtors Association, they were creating a strong financial incentive to create and preserve segregation. So all of this was cemented in 1932 with the creation of the Homeowners Loan Corporation. That was a New Deal program which was meant to prop up the flagging housing market during the Great Depression. It created maps which incorporated all the racist real estate practices I've already outlined in order to show the desirability of different neighborhoods. So in these maps, this one is from Portland in, I believe, 1934. In these maps, green meant the highest grade, followed by blue, yellow, and red. Red was reserved for most non-whites and lower-class Jews, and it is from these maps that we get the term redlining. Banks would not make loans to neighborhoods that were redlined. The Federal Housing Administration was also a New Deal agency meant to prop up both the banking and construction sectors. Before the FHA was created in 1934, buying a home meant paying 50% or more of the purchase price and paying off the rest of the mortgage in 5 to 10 years. And that meant that new homeownership was typically limited to people with very large cash reserves and substantial access to credit. However, with an FHA-backed loan, one could buy a home with, say, 20% down and pay the rest off with a 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. So this program essentially created the housing market that we know today. And by many measures, the program was a resounding success. It put opportunity for home ownership within the reach of millions more people. And it jump-started lending and borrowing again during the depths of the Great Depression. However, the FHA underwriting standards used the HOLC redlining maps in order to guide appraisers in the loan risk analysis. And for many years, the FHA would only back the financing for new subdivisions if the entire communities, would include racially restrictive deeds. As a result, fewer than 2% of the loans that FHA underwrote between 1934 and 1962 went to non-whites. As in the case of the Donation Land Act, the federal government put its finger on the scale, creating new opportunities for wealth for some while shutting out others. So there's another group of Oregonians that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the Japanese. After the Chinese Exclusion Act, a new source of labor was needed, and Japanese workers quickly filled in. Within a few decades, Japanese and Japanese Americans were growing the majority of Oregon's produce. The majority of Oregon's produce. I find that pretty stunning. And that led to a substantial amount of resentment by white farmers. In 1923, the state legislature passed the Alien Land Law, which barred non-citizens from purchasing or owning land. As a result, Japanese farmers would often register the name of the land in the name of their American-born children, who were American citizens. At the outset of World War II, about 4,000 Japanese Americans lived in Oregon. The largest community was in Hood River, where they made up about 4% of the population. In Portland, Japantown, or Nihonmachi, was a thriving community in what is today the Old Town Chinatown area. So 3 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forced the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry living west of Highway 97. 2/3 of those affected were American citizens. 2/3. They were either naturalized citizens or were born in this country. 3,700 were imprisoned at the Portland Assembly Center, or what is now Hall A of the Portland Expo Center. At the time, it was meant for livestock shows, but during the summer of 1942, it held human beings. An Oregonian headline from April 29th, 1942, proudly proclaimed, quote, "Portland is the first city to rid itself of Japs." After the Assembly Center, they were sent to concentration camps in Idaho, California, and Wyoming. By the end of the war, they had spent an average of 900 days behind barbed wire. Now, of course, with the removal of all those farmers, new labor again needed to be supplied quickly. We ended up in the same situation that had happened after the Chinese Exclusion Act. But that's especially true during wartime. Amalgamated Sugar Company needed agricultural workers to pick sugar beets, which were used in the production of explosives and rubber. So 15,000 Mexican farm workers were brought to Oregon in what was called the Bracero Program. Japanese, Mexican, and Native American farmers lived in extremely poor housing. You can see a picture of that in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Meanwhile, German and Italian POWs were also being used as farm workers, but by all accounts, they received better housing and better treatment from the local businesses. At the same time, the African-American population in Portland increased tenfold. Oh, sorry. Let me back up a second. A similar story exists for African-American servicemen in towns like Pendleton and White City. German and Italian POWs who were being held at those bases were treated with respect, while Black GIs were treated like they were the real enemy. And at the same time, the African-American population in Portland increased tenfold. It went from 10,000 to 20,000. Sorry, 2,000 to 20,000. But Portland did not have the housing to accommodate such a massive influx of people. So the Housing Authority of Portland was created to rapidly construct and manage public housing projects. Most of these projects were exclusive to white people. The two that weren't were Giles Lake in what is now the Northwest Industrial District, and Vanport, which was just south of the Expo Center. At its height, Vanport was the largest public housing project in the entire country and constituted the second largest city in Oregon. So on December 17th, 1944, Proclamation 21 was issued, which ended Japanese incarceration. Japanese and Japanese Americans had spent, as I mentioned, an average of 900 days behind bars. And while we do have some stories of neighbors welcoming them back with open arms, there are many more accounts of prejudice and hostility. In Hood River, Japanese Americans lost title to 75% of the land that they had owned prior to the war. Nationally, the Federal Reserve Bank estimated that ethnic Japanese lost more than $400 million worth of property. Widespread racism in the financial sector also led to the denial of mortgage loans, making it difficult to rebuild any of their pre-war prosperity. And in addition to the prevalent discrimination that Japanese Americans faced in public accommodations, there were also physical threats. Homes were looted, people were attacked. The once thriving farming community of Lake LaBiche, just north of Salem, had been burned to the ground. The late George Nakata, who was one of our bus tour presenters for many years, remembered having to go to the Japanese cemetery, which is still located in the Rose City Cemetery on Northeast Fremont Street, in order to repair and clean up after the years of vandalism of the grave sites. And in the state legislature, an amendment to the Alien Land Law was passed in 1945, which prevented Japanese from owning, leasing, living on, or working on farmland. Now, this was struck down by the Oregon Supreme Court, but not until 1949, so a significant amount of damage had been done. After the end of the war, African Americans faced widespread unemployment. In 1945, Black unemployment was 50%, while it was only 8% for whites. So to put that in context, the overall unemployment rate during the worst period of the Great Depression got up to about 35%. After the war, when we are in this ostensible boom time, unemployment for African Americans rises to 50%, and it was only 8% for whites. So there was tremendous pressure to leave Portland. The Red Cross was offering one-way bus tickets, and public assistance checks were cut off. Half of them ultimately left, and many of those who remained were in Vanport on Memorial Day 1948, when the Columbia River broke through the railroad dike and utterly destroyed the city. Displaced were pushed into substandard barracks at Giles Lake and Swan Island, and then many eventually moved to the already overcrowded Albina neighborhood. Obviously, the Vanport flood is one of the greatest tragedies in Portland's history, but 1948 did have one bright spot when it came to discrimination, which is Shelley versus Kramer. That was a Supreme Court case that marked, in some ways, the beginning of the end of legal segregation. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the restrictive covenants that I talked about earlier were legally unenforceable. Now, that is not to say that they were eliminated at that time. Certainly, they were still broadly in use, but courts courts were no longer recognizing them, and that is the very beginning of the end of legal segregation. In 1953, Governor Mark Hatfield signed the Oregon Civil Rights Bill, which prevented discrimination in public accommodations on the basis of race, religion, color, or national origin. This was followed up with a statewide fair housing bill in 1959. So there's this well-known story that when Mark Hatfield was in school at Willamette University in 1943, he was tasked with driving singer and activist Paul Robeson from a lecture he gave on civil rights to a hotel. But he soon realized that there was not a single hotel in Salem that allowed African Americans as guests. So he had to bring him all the way to the Benson in downtown Portland. And even once he got there, Paul Robeson was forced to enter through the back door. So this was a pretty formative experience for Mark Hatfield. He realized that if the most famous black man in America was facing this level of discrimination, then it must be even worse for the average person of color in Oregon. So Oregon's civil rights legislation began to correct that injustice. And yet, without strong government interventions, discrimination at the local and the interpersonal level continued to flourish. Realtors, lenders, and landlords maintained a de facto system of redlining even after the maps were no longer in use. Discrimination in public accommodations was intimately tied to this. As all things being equal, people are most likely to use the amenities which are closest to them. And as I mentioned earlier, some towns and counties maintained their sundown laws to keep out non-whites altogether. So there was a growing movement to tackle all of these issues with a fair housing law. The Fair Housing Act was initially in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but President Johnson eventually pulled it in order to keep his coalition together. In response, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began a campaign of direct action to desegregate housing in Chicago. During that time, his organization innovated fair housing testing, a tactic we still use today. As Dr. King described it, quote, "We sent Negroes in large numbers to the real estate offices in Gage Park. Every time Negroes went in, the real estate agent said, 'Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have anything listed.' And then soon after that, we sent some of our fine white staff members into those same real estate offices, and the minute those white persons got in, they opened the book. 'Oh yes, we have several things. Now what exactly do you want?'" Tragically, the Chicago Freedom Movement was one of the last campaigns Dr. King would lead. When Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th, 1968, it really seemed like the country might pull itself apart. Riots broke out in 125 cities, and it became clear that something significant needed to change to quell the unrest. So on April 11th, the Fair Housing Act was finally passed. It was regarded as the most difficult piece of civil rights legislation to sign into law, with constituent mail estimated to run 100-1 against the bill, and a very fragile coalition of legislators supporting it. So the recently departed Walter Mondale, who was then a senator from Minnesota and the chief sponsor of the bill in Congress, called it the Civil Rights Act for the North. And I love that quote. What he meant by that was that unlike in the South, northern cities didn't need explicit segregations in their schools, restaurants, and other public accommodations. If you could geographically separate where people lived, then you could maintain a de facto Jim Crow system. Now, the other argument that you heard against it, was very prevalent in those 100-1 against the bill constituent mail, was the argument that, quote, "a man's home is his castle," right? We think about this expression all the time, that there is this inalienable right to property that allows for prejudicial decisions in private transactions. However, the Fair Housing Act has been found to be a constitutional exercise of Congress's power to enforce the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. So it finally passed April 11th. That is why April is Fair Housing Month to this day. And this year we celebrate the 54th anniversary of the passage of the Fair Housing Act. Of course, yesterday was also the 54th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King. And those two events are inextricably linked. But we have to be honest with ourselves. Has it worked? Now, let's look at the positives first. Undeniably, it is a good thing to have a law on the books saying that people cannot be discriminated against on a protected class status if in any housing transaction. I think that that's pretty unambiguously a good thing, and it's good that there is an enforcement mechanism against that. However, when we pull back, when we look at the way that people actually live today, school segregation is as high as it has been in 70 years. The median white family has nearly 8 times the wealth of the median black family. 74% of formerly redlined neighborhoods are low to moderate income neighborhoods today. 74% of neighborhoods that were designated redlined 90 years ago are still low to moderate income neighborhoods. So clearly, there's some big picture stuff that the Federal Fair Housing Act has not managed to solve, and that it's going to take continuous work to try and figure out how we finally get out of this. So that does bring me to the end of the presentation. I mentioned that we've got the Fair Housing Hotline that if you or someone you know wants to get in contact with us, that's a really great way to get in contact with us and report possible housing discrimination. You can also contact information at FHCO.org. But I think the best thing to do is actually to go to our website. We've got lots of really great reporting tools that are there, and you can get in contact with the best staffer who can help you with any of these things. We've also got a lot of really great resources and materials that are free and open to access on the website. So I definitely recommend going there. But yeah, that brings me to the end of the presentation, and I know we'll have plenty of time for questions.
Well, thank you, Sam, for telling the story of housing discrimination in Oregon. As we mentioned before we went live, this is a history that for a long time has not been widely known. And in recent years, that situation is changing. And I appreciate how you provided that through line from the very beginning of Oregon's existence as a territory up through the present day. I want to share the link to the survey that Sam has shared with me. So I'm popping that in the chat right now. If you could take a few minutes to fill that out and submit that, that would be great. And I'll also post that again before we wrap up tonight. If you have questions or comments, please put those in the chat section and we can get to those. Part of our format tonight is to have a conversation about some of the issues that Sam mentioned in his presentation. So if something resonated with you or you have a question about any of that content, please drop that in the chat and we can get to it. Sam, before we went live, I asked if you were from Oregon and you said you weren't. And I was curious in our discussion at that time about your reaction to this history that we both acknowledged as up until recently been unemphasized. And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about what that was like for you to begin to piece together this chain of events that defined racial discrimination and housing discrimination in the state of Oregon.
Yeah, I think that is piecing together is a good way to put it, because a lot of these things are maybe talked about in isolation. I think that the kind of, hey, there were the Klan was real big in Oregon in the 1920s. Maybe people knew that part, or maybe they knew about the exclusion, the Black exclusion piece in the Constitution, or maybe they knew about the racial covenants. But I think what was lacking, what is lacking in a lot of conversations about our state's history, is the through line, right? The idea um, that there were more communities of color spread out across Oregon, and there, and then there was the rise to prominence of the Klan and other forms of racial terror, and the racial covenants piece, and those things all happen very sequentially, and they're really impossible to disentangle, right? So I think that through line was kind of what was missing. That the way the state looks today is really a result of that kind of sequential history, and that a lot of what we're seeing today comes from these institutions and decisions that all really happened in a pretty short period of time, that 1890 to 1930, when demographics really started to shift hard in Oregon, and in, the way that the state looks kind of came into being. I think that that's so startling and so left out of the conversation, that that like the first realtor code of ethics happened the same year that the Klan was hitting its peak. I think that those things are not discrete. Those things are not coincidental. And so, yeah, I just that kind of unified look at the state's history, I think is really important, and has maybe been missing in the conversation before.
Mm-hmm. And the title of your presentation, Ghosts of Our Past, the sense that there are these issues that have not ever really been resolved, or maybe can't be resolved, but then they just carry on into the next iteration. It's sort of the next version of that thing that nobody could figure out, right? Or that nobody wanted to figure out, and then it just compounds. And I think that's the interesting thing about this is that sense of continuity, and how repeatable all of this was. The other thing that struck me, and I mentioned this before we went on, is that I think a lot of times when we think of something like housing discrimination or housing displacement, we might think of this as being something that happens in secret, but this was all done out in the open. This was all done in plain sight, which I think is another really kind of striking part of this history, right?
Yeah, before 1948, those racially restrictive covenants had the force of law. Like it was regarded as legal contract that could be enforced by a court. So if someone lived in a house with a restrictive covenant and they wanted to sell that house to a person of color, then their neighbors could take them to court, and as for breaching contract, and that happened all the time. So it could not have happened at the scale that it did without the complicity of government and large institutions like realtors and banks. All of those people needed to be working in concert in order for the scale of segregation that we see today to happen.
And how did redlining, I mean, what is the legacy of redlining today? How do we see that played out today?
Yeah. Well, so redlining as a term has been talked about a lot more in the last few years, right? That's maybe not something that was part of the conversation. And I think a lot of people have different understandings of what it is. So literal redlining comes from those HOLC maps that I showed before. But there's also a lot of, what you might call modern day redlining, which is, like banks giving preferential treatment or large scale refusal of bank loans to a certain population, or what we saw right before the 2008 housing crisis, which is people in the Black community especially targeted with those subprime mortgage loans, which created a situation of mass foreclosures, particularly among Black Americans during the foreclosure crisis in 2008. So that, in some ways, was modern day redlining. The way that we have invested in communities, building parks and transportation, that can be a form of modern day redlining if we're focusing all our investment in certain neighborhoods and ignoring other neighborhoods. But what I have certainly found, if you look at the redlining map of, let's say, Portland, is that map from 1934, 90 years ago, still tells a lot of stories today, right? So if you look at the history of highway construction, let's say, so the construction of the I-5 was very careful to go to do maximum amount of damage right through South Portland, which is the historic Jewish and Italian neighborhood, and then go into North Portland right through Albina, like just cut right through Albina. And hundreds and hundreds of houses were destroyed and people were separated. And of course, there's the lingering effects of pollution in those areas today from having a highway going through that neighborhood. Meanwhile, when you have the construction of the I-84, right, the east-west highway that goes through East Portland, through the east side of Portland, it very carefully goes through Sullivan's Gulch in a way that's not going to affect houses on either side. Why is that? Well, there were green and blue line neighborhoods on either side. So it was very carefully plotted so that it wasn't going to be destroying those any houses in those predominantly white neighborhoods. So yeah, that's one perfect example of how you can see the 1934 map still telling a story today. You can see it in things like food deserts and health outcomes and temperature. That's actually a really big issue in Portland, where formerly red line neighborhoods are about 12 degrees hotter than formerly green line neighborhoods. So when you think back to the heat dome event, the extreme heat that we experienced last year, think about what that is, and now add 12 degrees to it. And you can imagine how that redlining from 90 years ago becomes a literal life and death issue today.
I'm wondering too about zoning and land use laws and the language that we use, right, to talk about those things. I mean, we use multi-use housing, single-use housing. I mean, what role does that play in also sort of perpetuating that sense of redlining?
Yeah, that's a great point. Formalized planning kind of came about in the 1930s, right? We talked about this earlier. People didn't catch our conversation, but I'm a real urban planning nerd. That's kind of how I got into this work. Le Corbusier, who's this designer and architect, he comes up with the idea of the garden city in the 1930s, where everything's really separated. Densities are separated, all the uses are separated, and that pretty quickly becomes the dominant planning method. right? That's kind of how early urban planners thought. So in some ways, there's some clear benefits to that, right? It separates industry from residential areas, for instance, which is great. Nobody wants to live next to a smokestack, right? But it also meant separating peoples and finding ways to use land use planning to further perpetuate the separation of peoples. So most housing zones today, and Oregon is changing, this is a little different in Oregon, but most zones for residential areas are single family or multifamily, and nothing really in between. So what you see if you are comparing it to redlining maps is that multifamily zones are very much in red and yellow line neighborhoods, and single family zones are very much in green and blue line neighborhoods. And so it's putting structures, which, by the way, don't mention race at all, overlaying that on a very racialized map. And that's part of why segregation has been so durable for the last 54 years since the 1968 Fair Housing Act, is because the segregation that we're experiencing now, it doesn't have to mention race. It doesn't have to mention national origin or color. They don't have to segregate people explicitly anymore because there are structures that keep people physically separated.
One of the pieces in this history that really stands out for me is the war years in the 1940s, and this huge explosion of workers who came to Portland to work in the shipyards, and really, in a sense, kind of forcing the city to address, and some would say it didn't, but to address the historic lack of African American residents, and that because that worker population grew so rapidly and to such a great extent that it really created this sort of backlash, and that a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of the ghosts, as you talk about, really kind of came out of the grave in the 1940s. Can you talk a little bit more about that particular period and why that's such an important era in housing discrimination?
Yeah, it is dramatically important, and I think that the reason that it's so key is because of because of the size of the federal government, right? The federal government didn't really get involved in housing policy before the Federal Housing Administration was created in 1932 and the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So these were New Deal agencies that really start to put the whole weight of the federal government into issues of housing. And then during the war years, that was turbocharged even more. So the shipyards in Portland were huge employers. I mean, it's a scale of employment that we've never seen before. Again, 20,000 people came to Portland to work in Henry Kaiser shipyards. That's enormous. I mean, that is an enormous shifting of people into one city, and that was happening in cities across America, and especially on the West Coast. So it's the industrialization and of housing and the amount of resources and authority that the federal government was putting in to issues of housing, and that on itself is not a bad thing, right? I think that it obviously opened up a lot of opportunities for a lot more people when it comes to living in quality housing and having access to quality employment. There's a lot of really good things that came out of that time, but it also means that if there's even a small amount of discrimination, and it was a lot more than a small amount, if there's any amount of discrimination in that, then multiply that by hundreds of thousands because of the size of because of the level of investment, because of the number of units that are being built. So if the largest public housing project in the country in Vanport, if the federal government says, well, these housing units need to be segregated, then that creates a huge segregationist impact. Every decision that gets made is multiplied simply because of, again, the size of the federal intervention in it. And that's what they did. So, I mean, and that's even after the war years. That's how public housing was run. Public housing was segregated in most cities in America. And it left an impact that we're still feeling today.
Mm-hmm. I think the other ghost, if I can use that term, that that I think is difficult for us to wrap our heads around. You presented it at the very beginning, is the wealth gap.
Yeah.
And I mean, I had not realized that the unemployment rate for African Americans right after the war, 1945, at war's end, was as high as it was. And I think when we look at this issue of the wealth gap, right, we have to address what that means. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, I mean, there's a lot to untangle here, but we're currently experiencing in our area and all over the United States, significant rates of homelessness, right? And many of the people who are most affected by homelessness are African Americans, Latino, and indigenous populations. And those are the ones that traditionally have not had access to the kind of wealth that allows them to kind of create this generational safety net. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about, I mean, maybe this is a bit harder to untangle, but what are the threads that connect that wealth gap to housing discrimination to homelessness?
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. So part of it, there's always the short-term story and the long-term story, right? So the short-term story, if you're even if you're just looking at it in isolation, like let's think about the 2008 housing crisis, which affected everyone. It really did affect a huge number of people, of every demographic. But post 2008, as you see the recovery, the recovery is just not there among African Americans. Home ownership rates have never bounced back from what they were before 2008, as they have, for white Americans, and increasingly even for Latinx Americans. It is finally starting to improve for Latinx Americans. African Americans haven't, and a lot of that is because of these historic displacement, discrimination, segregation. It is, as you say, it's a very tangled history. I don't know how to boil it down exactly, but I think that we have seen time and time again where certain opportunities are opened to white Americans where they're not opened to Black Americans. I always include that clip of Dr. King talking about, in that case he's talking about the Homestead Act, but he's they could easily be talking about the Oregon Donation Land Act as well, because it's an example of the federal government putting its finger on the scale in favor of one group and not others. And that is not to say that even without federal intervention, there haven't been times where there was, Black wealth building. I think before the 2008 housing crisis is a good example, or in the immediate era, post civil rights era, or at other times, plenty of other times in our history. But because of federal policy and local policy and organized harassment, there's not the safety net that exists for white Americans. So when a crisis happens, it really knocks the African American community, when it comes to home ownership at least, it really knocks them back in a way that other groups are not traditionally affected by, for a length of time that other groups are not affected by. So that's been the pattern. I mean, I think that's kind of the thread that connects all of it, because of these decisions.
Right. You mentioned 1948 as being, you said the beginning of the end, which I like. And one of the questions that came out, which I think is a valid one, is where are those moments of hope? Right. This is a pretty bleak story. It's
Yeah.
a pretty difficult story on many levels. So we've heard about the Shelley versus Kramer,
Mhm.
and some of the other legislation. What are let's identify some glimmers of hope in
Yeah.
this story.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I could talk a little bit about what's happening now, because I think that
Great.
we we have been in a pretty dark phase, post 1968. There has not been that much movement to address these issues. I think a big part of that is that chart that I showed, pretty close to the beginning of the presentation, where there's the line of the actual racial wealth gap and then the perceived racial wealth gap. And so there is a perception among many that, oh, things are getting better. There's been this long perception of continued, racial progress that just is not, that the numbers, don't carry any evidence for. But now there's, those perceptions do seem to be changing, and it does seem like people are saying, okay, well, let's really take some action. As the person who's interested in land use and urban planning, I followed House Bills 2001 and 2003 in Oregon with great interest. Those are the bills that, of course, allow for things like duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters in single family zones. So it's increasing the amount of housing opportunity in the areas that tend to have the most economic opportunity. So I think that making structures like that's a really important way to kind of break the back of those systemic structural segregationist issues, right? So that's something that gives me a lot of hope. On the federal level, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are the banks that that usually do the processing for federal housing loans, one of the things that they are going to start doing is taking things like positive rental history in the consideration of credit for home loans. So that's something that could make a meaningful impact on people who are trying to buy their first house, but have been kind of systemically left behind when it comes to access to wealth and credit. So that's something that I'm absolutely hopeful about. So I think we're going to see a lot of creative solutions like that to get us out of that. I don't know. I'd be curious, actually, as folks in the audience have learned more, if there's anything that they think are hopeful signs. I'm always curious and wanting to know what's happening in the local communities.
Right. Yeah. And I think maybe connected to this, I mean, I always like to include something in our programs as a kind of an action item. I mean, what can we do, right? I mean, how can we get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. The reason that I tell this history, so Fair Housing Council, we're a civil rights organization. We have a very specific day-to-day thing that we do to counter housing discrimination. The reason that we're telling history, even though we're not really a history-focused institution, is to let people know that segregation and discrimination is not organic. It's not something that just happened. I think that that's a really disempowering thing, is to think, well, the way things are is just the way things are. It's the result of, all these things that just happen, and it's the way it's always been. It's not organic. It didn't happen by accident. And that means that we need institutional action in order to get us out of that. And so that's what we need to advocate for. So when it comes to, housing opportunities in your community, I'd say go to planning commissions and go to city council. And if there are people in the community who are using, coded language to deny housing opportunity, then recognize it as coded language and testify in favor of more housing opportunity in your community. Because I think that's what it's going to take. It's going to take, for a long time, the loudest voices in the room have been those who don't want to do anything differently, right? Who have rejected more housing opportunity, more inclusive communities. And we certainly need people to be voices in favor of more housing opportunity. We also need more eyes and ears, honestly. Even if you're not comfortable with voicing your thoughts and trying to advance housing opportunity yourself, I would say our organization is always looking for on-the-ground intelligence about what's happening, because we're a pretty small office. We don't have the resources to watch every single city council meeting across the entire state of Oregon. So if you're hearing about things that are happening in your community that are raising red flags and you find are troubling, let us know. And maybe there's something that we can do about it. Maybe there's some way that we can intervene and maybe testify in favor of more housing opportunity. That's something that, that's part of the work that I do personally. So yeah, reach out to me, even if you don't feel comfortable testifying yourself.
Great. And as a librarian, my action items are: become more informed. There are some really great books. The Color of Law by Edward Rothstein is a fascinating. Richard Rothstein. Is a fascinating book. Race for Profit by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, and there's also a new book that just came out called Freedom to Discriminate, which looks at how realtors, the role that realtors played. Anything that you can do to become more informed about this history on a local level, on a regional level, and a national level, that's going to be my action item, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that people, find this really overwhelming. And I never want people to come away from a history presentation thinking that was horrible and there's nothing I can do about it. Because that's not what I want you to take away from this, right? I know it's overwhelming. I know it can be hard. There are, in some ways you're right. There's nothing you can do about things that happened 150 years ago, but there are ways that the institutions that we have today could redress those things. And those are things that you can actually push for in your community. So at FHCO.org, we have something called the Good Neighbor Guide. And it talks about the specifics of Oregon land use law and how you can, what you should be advocating for and how best to understand it and communicate it to your neighbors. And so that, I think, would be a great place to start. If you have never testified, if you're a novice to land use issues, it's a really simple, like 4-page guide that you can look at.
Great. Well, Sam, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing this history. As I said, I don't think we can ever hear this too much. And I think every time we do hear it, it gets us one step closer to visualizing those ghosts of the past that you talk about and coming to terms with it. And making sure that we don't continue to drag this heritage with us into the future. So thank you very much, Sam, for joining us. I'm going to paste the link to the survey. Let me get that over here one more time. And please take a moment to fill that out at your convenience. And we'd love to know what you think of this program. And I'm sure Sam and the folks at Fair Housing Council of Oregon would also love to know what you learned tonight and what you thought. So Sam, again, thanks very much. Everybody, thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you on Zoom 2 weeks from tonight for No More Kin Dread. Remember that name, No More Kin Dread, like your kin. Okay. And we'll also obviously see you in the library. So until next time, everybody, be well, be safe, and thanks for joining us. Good night.